He polishes his image as the gentle leader playing with children from the state-operated kindergarten near his residence, the former palace of colonial governors. What about the man behind the image? This reporter spoke with Professor Bernard B. Fall of Howard University, whose book, The Two Vietnams, contains the first Western biography of Ho.
If Ho Chi Minh were a Westerner, he would probably be known as the best public relations conscious Western ruler in the world. He is extremely response conscious. Everything is done with its effect, its ultimate effect on the populace. The uncle idea is his idea. It's Bác Ho in Vietnamese. It's Uncle Ho. Remember these words by an American officer who knew him back in '45. He says, this awfully sweet old guy. You know, well, you don't go around and call Stalin or even Gomulka or Khadr an awfully sweet guy, or even Tito. These may be at certain times not totally despicable people. But nobody will ever say of Mao Zedong he was an awfully sweet old guy. Whereas of Ho Chi Minh, this sort of thing comes through. Now, some people say this is a 24-hour-a-day act. And it will point to the fact that when it comes down to the crunch, Ho Chi Minh in the past has at least allowed, if not ordered, the execution of some fairly old associates. But Ho Chi Minh has succeeded in preserving, in keeping a distance from all this. It's always the assumption, if only Ho Chi Minh knew, these things wouldn't take place. And this has really been a fantastic performance in this particular sense. Nothing that ever happens in North Vietnam that's bad reflects on Ho Chi Minh as a person. There's yet, in South Vietnam, for example, anyone who's willing to go on record insulting Ho Chi Minh as a person. I'm sure you're as aware as I am that the South Vietnamese will say a great deal about the North Vietnamese, that they're communist puppets, that they're fighting China's wars, etc., etc. But you will not find anybody who say Ho Chi Minh is a dirty bird. Some of the things that you hear in South Vietnam always is, well, when everything's been said and done, Ho Chi Minh is the George Washington of this country. And we are in the unhappy position of having to find a counter George Washington. And these people are hard to find these days, anywhere.
Ho Chi Minh now begins to mend his fences abroad. In 1955, he flies to Peking and gets $350 million in Chinese aid from Mao Zedong. A year later, Khrushchev makes his famous speech attacking Stalin and inaugurating the Sino-Soviet split. Ho, though pro-Russian, is caught in the middle. He needs Russian industrial help, but cannot forget Red China's control of his communication lines. Professor Fall.
It is very easy to compare Ho Chi Minh to Mao Zedong. You are two Asian leaders, two old apparat boys, etc., etc., almost of the same age, by the way. Yet the fact is, Ho Chi Minh spent 30 years in the West traveling from 1911 to 1941, literally, when he moved into China, whereas Mao Zedong spent most of his life in the grottos and caves of northeast China. Ho Chi Minh has seen the French in France, he's seen the British in Britain, he's seen the Americans, presumably, in perhaps New York and Boston. I'm sure in New York he saw more than Harlem. In other words, I don't feel that the problem of not understanding what the United States is about is really the problem with Ho Chi Minh. It may come with the junior leaders. The junior leaders, of course, have spent most of their life in isolation, but not Ho Chi Minh.
His junior leaders, Pham Van Dong, Prime Minister, intelligent and tough, General Giap, Defense Minister and Armed Forces Chief, a popular man, but in communist countries, military men rarely become politicians. Lê Duan, the Communist Party boss, during the French War, top party leader in the South. And there are others, such as Trong Chin, whose adopted name, Long March, shows his Chinese allegiance. While the political struggle continues, communist aid and free world trade flow through the port of Haiphong. Government sources say that ships from 25 non-communist nations called on the port, bringing in machinery needed for the country's industrialization drive and exporting its coal. According to Secretary of State Rusk, no strategic items are traded, however. Ho realizes that only industrialization can strengthen his food-deficient country. But to industrialize, one must have trained workers. Soviet bloc and Chinese experts and economic aid of over $1 billion have poured in over the past 10 years. In most cases, this is still an economy which depends on coolie labor. Modern factories are built by hordes of human ants. built at the expense of the living standards of the people. Such achievements as the Chinese Tai Nguyen steel plant or the Russian Lamtao chemicals combine are nonetheless impressive. So is Ho's own performance as a fence straddler between Peking and Moscow. Again traveling abroad, he not only is well received by Khrushchev in Moscow, but he also visits most of the East European satellites and several uncommitted countries. Everywhere, Uncle Ho in the simple Mao Zedong uniform is a social hit. He also calls upon that prime example of independent communism in the world, Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia, a gesture that surely is not appreciated in Peking. Could Ho Chi Minh become such a Tito? Would he want to? The drama comes into the open in November 1961 in Moscow at a party congress. As the last of the old Bolsheviks in power, Ho, with Khrushchev, enjoys an honored place next to Hungary's Kadar and Russia's future strongman Brezhnev on the parade grandstand atop Lenin's tomb. But seemingly nothing can heal the widening breach between the Soviets and Peking. The Chinese are hell-bent on proving that their type of militant communism is the only true path to victory over the capitalist world. They openly call for a repudiation of the Soviet leadership by the world's communist parties. Ho and his party are at a crossroads. The old leader rises and in a quavering voice pleads for reconciliation between the two brother parties. But the Chinese stomp out and expect the North Vietnamese to follow suit. Ho leaves the Congress, but instead of going home, he travels about Russia and finds time to dance with the students at Minsk High School. CBS News chief European correspondent Charles Collingwood asks British scholar P.J. Honey of London University about Ho and the Sino-Soviet split.
Obviously, he's interested in the Sino-Soviet dispute. He has walked his tightrope. He has moved closer to China or to Russia as the occasion demanded. But this is really something outside. He's only interested in it insofar as it affects the running of his state and the execution of the policies of that state. I would describe him as a communist, but primarily as the ruler of North Vietnam. In other words, they're prepared to kowtow to the Chinese, but if the Chinese start intervening in North Vietnam, then the Vietnamese are not prepared to stand this.
All that Peking has offered North Vietnam so far is a great deal of bellicose speeches.
Professor Fall.
You can just visualize a meeting of this small in-group and the Muscovites saying to the Pekingites in the group, you see what we got from all your soft from your big talking? You're bombed by the United States. We're now embroiled in an open-ended war because the war is open-ended on both sides.
What about the possibility of Peking raising volunteers, unquote?
That is always possible, but again, Giap has enough troops to feed into South Vietnam for the next 5 or 8 to 10 years while they're running out of troops in the north. Here again, we speak of, after all, of almost a 500,000-man army, which has more than 1 million men of trained reserves. And they feed them in at the present rate of about 40,000 troops a year. So they can go on for a long time.
In the meantime, however, the North Vietnamese are intervening on their own in South Vietnam. Nguyen Hue Tho, the rarely seen leader of the Viet Cong, as the South Vietnamese Liberation Front is commonly called, operates from a headquarters deep in South Vietnam's jungles. What had started out in 1957 as a guerrilla operation has erupted into a major war involving more than 1 million men. The American response to the spreading war is first to send in advisors to the South Vietnamese army. When this proves insufficient, President Johnson orders the bombing of North Vietnam in February of 1965 and the landing of American military forces in March. In April, he offers Ho unconditional discussions, as in 1946, there were perhaps missed opportunities on both sides. But Ho's counteroffer, in the form of 4 points, is tantamount to a demand for Western surrender. Apparently, like the French, the Americans must be totally defeated, as American air power systematically destroys North Vietnamese military targets. Ho's country becomes a country once more at war.